Before we begin, in the spirit of reconciliation and respect, the InkGuild acknowledges that we live, work, and play on the traditional Treaty 7 territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Ganaya, Piikani, as well as the Stoney Nakoda and Tsuut'ina nations. This territory is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. Finally, we acknowledge all Indigenous and non-Indigenous to honor and celebrate this territory alongside us.
No, I'm trying to sound like the meme groan.
All I can think of is the THX opening, okay? That's all I can think of.
I don't know.
I don't know what that was.
That sounds like a cow driving past me really fast in the back of a pickup.
I thought it was a sad trombone.
That's it. This is no longer a podcast. This is Gabriel noise interpretation. It's my new type of charades.
I'm still gonna go.
Here, hang on. I'll send what I'm doing.
You'll send what you're doing.
Yeah, this is what I'm. This audio.
Well, that is forever embedded in my hard drive. Thank you.
Gabe, you don't have to keep doing it.
I know. I'm sorry.
It's okay. I'm gonna super layer all of them together at once to make it really loud just one time. It'll be fantastic.
Just one time.
Just once.
Perfect.
The very.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Hello, everybody.
Welcome back to the InkGuild Podcast. Just go to fucking therapy. And you know what? I'm not going to say anything bad. I want to work with you publishers.
Don't correct me. I don't care.
Get an email.
Species. It's brilliant.
Look how stupid his fucking hair looks.
I would say spoiler alert, but don't read her books.
It was adorable.
It's very cringy. So cringe. Disgusting.
Aggressive support. Yeah.
Thank you for the psychic damage. He's a furry that goes out at night and beats people up. You're telling me he's competing with the flying Jesus metaphor?
I brought you to this podcast. I can take you out. I'm signing out of the cowboy episode. Good night.
This is a powerful piece.
So, did you get a degradation kink since we last talked? Because they're being real mean to you.
You got almost all of those wrong.
And
Oh, I forgot what
You get distracted by Gabe.
Roll the intro. Hello. What the? Huh?
Yes. Chaos.
I actually have the file on this computer. I could roll the intro music if I really wanted, but I'm not going to. It is on here somewhere. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the InkGuild Podcast. I'm Tyler, joined tonight by roll call.
Yeah.
Did we say hello now?
Take yourself.
Hello.
I'm parentheses.
Hello.
I'm Roll. And we'll be talking about introduce session and how it will work, end bracket, period. So today is... Dean's gonna fucking hate me. Today we're talking about gods and myths and monsters part 2. So this is a continuation of some world building episodes we've been doing, as well as a part 2 to one that I wasn't a part of, which means I don't remember it, so I don't know what we talked about. I'm assuming gods and myths and things.
It's possible.
I've asked everyone to...
It's not like we were both in that episode.
See? Not something I would remember. Again. Everyone's been asked to bring a couple examples of things. We're going to try not to do a hardcore case study, but I want everyone to be able to talk about their stuff, so if it's someone needs to rail off some details, we'll just go with it. Definitely wanted to discuss the creation of your gods, myths, monsters, pantheons, and the like, as well as examples of ones that we've seen done well in media, obviously, and of course, historical shenanigans that were our favorite mythologies, the Greek one that everyone knows super well. There was only one Greek one in my mind. But anyways. With that, nothing much to say. Let's get into it. Let's start with gods and things. What do we think makes an interesting pantheon selection or singular god? What's something that we've liked in past or we've used in present that we enjoyed seeing?
Gods.
I think gods are cool when they're really strong and they're like. Someone else start.
Okay, so I generally like gods in two wildly different spectrums. I like gods that are kind of like, you can look at them and realize, hey, that's just a superpowered asshole. Or gods that are completely unknowable. Right? So, like, if you have a giant clothing, yes, new word, I will coin it right now. A giant floating ball of space gas that is sentient and is now a god. I think that's interesting, because what is the space gas going to do? Nobody knows, least of all the space gas. But I also enjoy stories that have gods that are a little more understandable and fallible.
Yeah. So, fallibility of gods is interesting, because if we go based off of IRL mythologies, we've got some where gods are definitely extremely fallible. Greek mythology, and also Norse, looking at you. But then we've got some where the gods are supposed to be supreme, completely perfect in every way. Looking at you, Christianity. What's the preference? What makes each interesting?
I think it really depends on the story for me. But usually if we're going for more of like a Christian-like god, I find that stories about that kind of character are more interesting if the character is not actually present. And it's more about like, a person's like relationship with that kind of god. Whereas like if you're going to have actual present gods in the story, they're more like characters when there's like something fallible to them. I also just love stories where like characters think their gods are perfect and infallible, and then they like meet them and they're like, oh, you suck actually.
You suck. Yeah, good. Very true. Like, is the god going to be a character, or is it going to be a writing and story device? Right?
Yeah.
I love it when stories have gods mentioned in them, but there's no actual gods that are there per se. I like playing with the idea of a character's belief, particularly, especially if you're trying to write or world build off of a religious society, where you mention God all the time but do not acknowledge and or
like confirm it?
Yeah, confirm that the god is actually there. Are these people worshipping something that isn't there anymore? Or are they actually worshipping a force? I find that is a really interesting take, especially when you have a god that is quote unquote perfect. Because then you can get the implication, the not being perfect, because I can't speak, through the lens of your characters, and then there's always that layer of doubt.
Playing the whole like faith angle.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think faith is really interesting to explore in stories.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely not one of the core motivators in like a lot of my stories, because that is my jam. I do love it. Speaking of fallible and I guess to some extent infallible gods, book series I've read recently, I've talked about it before, Gideon the Ninth and the follow-up Harrow the Ninth, the Locked Tomb series. There's not necessarily an actual god per se, but there's a character that is represented as god, and it's your typical space sci-fi god emperor of mankind, because humanity cannot get enough of that terminology for some reason. And so in the first book, we never meet him, right? His influence is everywhere. They talk about him all the time, and it's done in that very worshipy, very infallible, God above all kind of way. In the second book, we actually meet him. And he's just some dude, really and honestly, in a lot of ways. Yes, he is supremely powerful, but I still remember the one line, because our main character, Harrow, in the second book, she's basically a nun to this god. And she's met him, and she's hanging out with him, and she's getting trained on all these special magic-y things by him. And he goes and gets drunk with two of his lieutenants, and they start a threesome on the kitchen table in front of her. And she's fucking shook, because this is her literal god that just started making out with these two, like, teachers that she has, because they're all about 10,000 years old. So, like, they've gone around the merry-go-round a couple of times, relationship-wise. And it's all very well done in story. But poor Harrow's sitting there like, what is God doing in front of me? What the fuck? And I really enjoyed that. Especially, again, a shift from the first book where he was infallible golden boy.
I still have.
This sounds vulgar, disgusting. What is it? What's the title? Where can I buy it? What store?
No.
Yeah.
It's
the more I learn about these books, the more they intrigue me.
Very good. Very solidly written, very interesting concepts and magic system. But I digress. There's an example of, like, one of the most interesting, and again, I put in quotation marks, gods I've ever had written into a story. That kind of filled both slots of infallible and personable at the same time.
Yeah, I absolutely love when, like, what playing around with that idea. I think a big part of, like, the appeal of the Greek gods I've found is that, like, they are really powerful beings, but then they're also just like people. Like I like the dynamic of having both, you know.
Yeah, I love the idea in any sort of, like, if it's like historical myths and shit, or like just like anything in fiction where it I forget what I was gonna say, but like but where it's like fucking around with the idea of gods being like these like perfect beings who are like only perfect insofar as they're like they're just extremely powerful, but then like they're just assholes. They're just like what any other person would be like if they had, like, not any other person, but like what, like, I mean, in Greek mythology, like, I feel like Greek mythology was all like, hey, like, what if, I don't know, what if Joe had godlike power? He'd be a dick, right? And that's the whole basis of it. That shit's great. Love that.
New world building concept. Joe gets superpowers. What a bad idea that was.
Very accurate Greek name.
The most accurate, yeah. I know so many Greek guys named Joe.
Joacles, right? It's Joacles. Yeah, bringing up the Greek stuff. Always love the Greek mythology. Obviously, it's the jam. It's everybody's jam. And talk about, like, personable gods. We've got gods who cry because something bad happened to them. We've got spiteful. We've got wrathful. We've got loving. We've got the whole gamut of emotions, right? And truthfully, characters to go along with it. Yeah. Greek.
What I love about Greek mythology is that it feels like a lot of, like, you know, like, sort of modern religions are just all about, like, I don't know. I feel like most Abrahamic gods are fucking Mary Sue's. Most, like, Greek gods are like cautionary tales.
We're gonna get so canceled.
Whatever.
I'm okay with it. You're right. You're very right. Who's plot armor, eh? Now, talking a bit about, like, pantheons to solo worship. style gods, right? And we've had many in human society. Personally, I often tend to write pantheons as opposed to singular gods, though I'm not opposed to it. And for me personally, I do the character thing, right? It's a lot funner to have multiple characters filling out the roles. But what's everyone else's preference? Singular, pantheon, some weird in between?
For me, it depends a lot on the world. If I'm going like gods actually exist in my world, I tend to go pantheon, just because I think they're more interesting. Just because you have like, I feel like if you're going like the monotheistic route, and there's like one god, then you have to like create a bunch of like other things in order to like interact with that one god, you know? Whereas like with pantheons, you can be like, oh, well, this god and this god did this, and that caused this to happen. And I don't know, just having one god do everything is so boring when it comes to myths. I'm sorry. I'm not sorry. It's true.
We're not sorry. We're definitely not sorry.
So, if we're talking about weird in-betweens between, like, one god and a pantheon of gods, and I'm sorry, universe and internets about this, Warhammer actually has a wild combination of this. And I don't know if any of you guys have interacted with Warhammer. Have you guys? I know Tyler has.
Not at all.
Okay.
I've interacted with a little bit.
Okay. So essentially, it's wild because one empire is like, we only have one god, and he's that dead dude on a throne, and he is our god and the only god. But there's also, like, other gods just out there floating, and they're called chaos gods, and they will just, like, slurp your soul away if they can, and it's actively hilarious. Because the Empire is like, there is only one god, the god emperor of mankind. Which is why I was so silent after Tyler said it, because I was like, don't bring up Warhammer, Penwarden. But then we started talking about, like, a pantheon versus a singular god. And this Empire refuses. It's like, nope, no other gods exist. We refuse to tell anyone about them. And then their souls get sucked up by chaos gods. It's kind of great.
Yeah, especially because like there's not just the chaos gods either. Several of the other factions in the setting have their own gods that do exist. Some of them literally come onto the battlefield and kill people. So like, sorry, you're not the only god. You're a dude strapped to a throne. Humanity, eh?
It's just really funny. I love it.
But Warhammer also brings up another interesting point, is we don't have to have just like one singular god or one pantheon in a setting, right? We can have multiple religions, and how they interact is often quite fun, in my opinion.
Yeah. That's what I have on Ariana, is like I have a bunch of different ones. Most of them are not well developed, but there's just like a bunch of little different religions all over, from like with different gods and different ideas about the world. Because I don't know, that's how real life is, and I wanted to reflect that.
Right.
I feel like I always struggle writing like deities and like religions in worlds where like there is like a tangible. I feel like in Lemonheart, I have a much easier time writing religions because I'm not focusing on like what like an actual god would be, because that's not about that. But then I feel like in like any of my fantasy work where there are gods, I always struggle to write religions because I can't wrap my head around people. I can't wrap my head around being religious in a world where like gods exist, and I know that they exist, and I'm religious in a way that doesn't believe in them. That I can't wrap my head around it.
The stubborn atheist exists, yes.
But it's also like a lot of religions are like the idea of belief, despite there being no evidence, is like important. So when you do have evidence, is it still belief in the same way that we think of it as?
Yeah.
See, this makes me link back to Greek mythology, because in the Greeks' mind, they did have evidence that the gods existed, right? And a lot of people do believe that they have evidence of their religion existing, even if we look at it from our outside view and we say, no, that's not real. But Greeks believed that lightning strikes were Zeus getting fucking pissed. They believed that if you got struck by a lightning and died, they would leave your corpse on the side of a road because they were like, Zeus is mad at you and we ain't touching that, right? So, yeah, there is some vestigial proof of religion in human psyche, but no one's ever met a god, as far as we can, surmise. All the stories should technically probably be lies. But if you meet this Joe Blow schmo who dresses and acts like Zeus and says he's Zeus and says, and I command the lightning to strike, and then a storm rolls in because he got lucky, who's to say? How would your belief change?
There's also, like, in fantasy settings, because I feel like when you world build to tell a story about a character. And if you have gods that are very well developed, it's because you're probably going to be interacting with them later, right? But most of the world probably is not going to be interacting with the gods. Most of your fantasy world probably will not be, like, getting miracles left, right, and center. So that's also a very interesting thing to examine through your stories, right? Because you may have, your main character may have proof of the magical sky fairies coming down and saving their backsides, but does their temple? Does anything else? Or are they functioning off of a limited scope, like people who are deeply religious function off of their belief?
I don't know. I just think it's interesting to think about.
It is.
Yeah. I
love fantasy stories where, like, there is, like, a god and there is, like, some sort of god stuff happening. And then in universe there are, like, religions, and the religions are, like, almost right. That clicks like a very specific button for me.
Same. It's literally one of my most used writing tropes when it comes to writing a fantasy world specifically, is that I will write up a bunch of fun and interesting religions and how they interact. Here's a monotheistic one. Here's a pantheistic one. Here's a weird hedonist self-insert one. All the good ones. And then how they interact. But I've always got, like, a document or a notepad running besides all of those that's like, the truth is what I call it every time, which is always how the world was actually made and which religions are getting it close to right, or are all of them wrong, or is something else entirely happening. I always have that sort of, like, true world build going somewhere, and then the reasons why these religions spawned as well. But an interesting quote, we've talked about mixed religion world building where we've got multiple different ones, but we've also talked about being able to interact with your gods. So if we've got Nation A, who's monotheistic with their one great god, and Nation B with their pantheistic and their multiple gods, but we want to write a story where characters from each side can interact with their gods, how do you do it? Which side's right? The filler silences in this episode. Dean is really going to hate me.
I was going to say, I feel like, again, it depends on the story and what you're trying to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't think when it comes to, like, religion and gods and stuff, there's ever going to be, like, one right way to do it.
Oh, yeah. I'm just musing.
Yeah. I really have to, like, talk about, like, our examples. Yeah, or like...
Yeah, of course. No, you can go into examples that you've used of these sorts of things. We're just trying to, make it more fluid.
So I do have in the Glass Inferno and on that world map, there are a couple of those countries that are sort of like either very religious or like sort of controlled. So like two of the big ones. I don't know if the map is readily available, so I won't like get into specifics on the countries. But two of the big ones are one of them is Aegis. That's that one that's like sort of shaped like a hook that we were talking about the last one because it looked weird. That is like a very, very like religious, almost culty place, and it's ruled by the god of death. And he's very, it's very like, it's very played up in like in the religious aspect of it. But he is like a very tangible god of death. He's just in the shadows and stuff. And then a near neighboring country, Diabel is ruled by another god named Parad, who is the god of contest, and he's much more public. But his whole thing is that he's like almost like not godlike in his way. So the city is built around a massive arena where he hosts like basically just like sporting events and duels to the death and stuff, so that he can like feed off of the power of just continuous contest and like duel out divine rewards and stuff to keep people like coming back and entering the tournaments and stuff. But it's very like you have like one area that's very religious, and then one area that's very almost like sort of unreligious and almost like normal, but both of them are controlled by god or like these demigod type characters. In Diabel, generally speaking, most of the people are they're not devout worshippers of Parad, because the way that Parad interacts with them is like sort of ungodly. He's like some of the other gods in the pantheon think he interacts with people way too much. And so Korsho's the god of death. His people are very zealous, and they are not into it. There's one character who enters into Parad's arena with the explicit intent of of killing Parad eventually once she wins, because she's a member of Korsho's undying cathedral. There's it's more like I wouldn't say there are holy wars in Glass Inferno. There's more just like scheming and backstabbing. Most of the gods they just don't like each other very much, and they live separate from one another, except for the ones who do like each other, but they're mostly in their own pairs and away from the other ones as well.
All right, so like some inter-conflict going on, obviously, between at the very least the members of the religions, right?
Yeah.
See, a big part of religious world building to me is, why would someone worship this deity? And looking at real world religions, there's obviously the idea of two things that I think drive most, and that's creation and afterlife. And in a lot of pantheons, and especially monotheistic ones, the reason the monotheistic god is worshipped is because they created, and then they provide an afterlife. And that's often like a starting point for me. So taking your example there, Gabe, you've mentioned a god of death. Do they provide an afterlife? Is that the reason people follow them?
So he does the opposite. He does just the opposite. Most of the people who are sort of members of the Undying Cathedral are like Korsho does stuff to like keep them alive for he like prolong their life, and Parad does stuff to like enrich people's lives. Not even the demigods know much about like the afterlife. None of them have been there, so they don't do stuff for that, but they do stuff to try to like keep all their power comes from the living world, and they feed off of like stuff that happens in the living world. So they're not too focused on the after. None of the demigods at least are too focused on the afterlife. Some of the more cosmic gods are, but none of them have much worship because they're like less known.
Interesting.
So, like, you've sort of got gods ruling nations then, almost.
Yeah.
What I'm understanding. Yeah.
Some of the gods rule nations, and some of them live in isolation from the world. There's like there are I think there are 13 or 14 gods in my demigods in this pantheon, so there's a bit of variety there.
Now, when you say like pantheon, they all relate to the same type of godhood then in your setting? Like someone could theoretically worship the whole pantheon?
Someone could, yeah. I guess there are two pantheons, but so of the demigod pantheon, yeah, someone could potentially worship all of them at once, because they're all vaguely siblings, or like Siblings is the wrong word. They're all vaguely like the same thing.
Okay, I get the feel. Kind of reminding me of like Polynesian Islander mythology in small extents. If
I would know, I don't know anything about it other than the movie Moana.
Okay, yeah, that's an okay basis, I guess. Okay, not too bad, not too bad. Interesting. I love how like personal the gods are. Like, here's an arena, battle for my enjoyment. Very dictator.
Yeah.
It's very amusing, yeah.
Now, we talked a little bit about like creation and afterlife while we're on Gabe's example still. I take it none of these gods necessarily created your world?
No, there are technically two gods who participated in the actual creation of the world, and none of the demigods had any hand in it.
Oh, I see. Is this something that's like a widely known fact, or does every demigod be like, "No, I made you"?
Some of the demigods act like they had a more cosmic role in the universe, and others are like, they don't do that. Korsho is like definitely the one who is the most deceitful of like his followers and like in what he actually does and like what he actually is. He's definitely the most like deceptive.
Mm-hmm. Church of Death bad. Who knew?
Well, that's funny because in Crown, the god of death is like not bad.
Didn't stick with the typical Grim Reaper look?
Well, they kind of have the look going. I kind of fantasy-ified it a little bit. But they got like the big heavy cloak and like a mask, like a masquerade style mask over their face. But I tend to dislike making my death gods evil, because I think it kind of, not that like they can't be, because, you know, a lot of religions are, like a lot of gods and stuff are built off of like, you know, real fears, and a lot of people fear death. But when I have actual gods of death that like actually exist and weren't just created as part of a religion, I don't like to make them evil because I don't like the idea that death is evil, I guess. So I tend to make my death gods a lot more neutral. Mm-hmm. They don't mean any harm. They're just doing their job kind of thing.
Ah, so the bureaucratic stuck in an office death god. Love it. Love it.
Yeah.
I'm making a joke of a video game that I know Lee played, so that's all. Death gods are something I honestly really shy away from as a whole, especially if I'm building a fantasy pantheon. And we'll talk about science fiction pantheons when I eventually get Lee onto the Mythic Cosmos talk train. But, like, I don't know. I find I shy away so hard just because of how many people do it. But I've never really seen, in at least common media, a non-evil or nice passing death god. So what is yours like about? Is it existing as part of the greater pantheon? Is death worshipped in any way?
Well, and so this is where I like to have a lot of fun with religion in my stories. And so in Crown, a lot of people are like very scared of the death god. Their name is Aksha. And they are part of a pantheon of 13. I've actually been like writing the creation myth of this world recently. And one of the things that I'm doing is like saying they've been around since the beginning, but people kind of like refuse to acknowledge that. Just because I think that's interesting. Oh my God. Word, what are you doing right now? But like, so yeah, people are scared of them. Because they're also like, a lot of the gods in this world are not like the god of one thing. They're the god of like multiple things, which is not, I mean, like that's based in other gods as well. But they're also the god of magic, which people are very scared of in this world. And so they're scared of death and they're scared of magic. So they're scared of this god and they're scared of this god's followers, but this god also does have followers, but like it's the kind of fear that like you don't want to piss off the god, so like people will still leave actually like the bare minimum of like offerings and that kind of stuff, just so that they don't piss them off.
Fair. I love a good. Well, are they wrathful? That's actually a good question. Would they take offense to things and actively participate in vengeance, or would it just be like their followers sort of deal?
The people believe that they would. Like the people of the world definitely believe that they would be wrathful. Because I am the author and I know the actual character of the death god, I know that they probably don't care.
Love a good chill death god. Yep.
Yeah. I don't know. Aksha's one of my favorite gods that I've created. I think they're very interesting.
You mentioned you were working on creation mythos.
Yeah.
Is there something you want to share with that, or like touch on the afterlife bit? Because again, I find those two coincide very well with why gods exist.
Yeah, so again, like there's a pantheon of 13, and all of the gods have like an equal, as it were, except for one of them, who's like the special god, I guess.
That's a hell of a domain to have. Yep.
They're the god of the mountains, but like you wouldn't guess that the mountain god is the special one, but they're there for a reason. But Aksha's equivalent is Ilis, who's the god of like creation and like existence and life, birth, sex, all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I've been working on a creation myth, which basically you have nothing and then you have creation and they come together and that like creates the world. And then they have the family god, I think, will come into existence next. Like I said, this is still very much in progress. But yeah, like the god of like family and marriage and all that stuff will probably come into existence next, and as like an act as kind of like a mother figure into bringing the rest of the gods into existence.
I like the mixed domains. The domains you've been talking about, they do make sense to be combined within one deity.
Yeah, I did my best with that. There's a few that for example, the moon god in this world is also the god of the ocean, which I don't see very often, but I just thought it would be fun to do that.
And it makes sense, yeah.
It does make sense. It's just not something that I see very often. Usually those are different domains because, you know, the moon is the sky.
Now, creation, making sense. Loving the domain combinations. What about afterlife stuff? Who's got the heaven control going on, or is there one?
My problem is when I started writing this story, I was very heavily basing it off of like Christian mythos. So I had like a heaven, hell, and like purgatory. And I've been trying to take it out of like the Christian mythos. But Aksha is the god that is considered like the god of the afterlife. And like rules over the afterlife as a domain. I do think there are multiple afterlives. I still haven't figured out the specific details for them yet, though.
I always find afterlife, again, super interesting, because real life, often what we find is people are God-fearing, right? Worried that you'll go to hell, hoping that you'll go to heaven, right? So, besides those constituents and the fact that these gods are real and do have active followers, what does keep people believing, per se? How active is the presence of some of these deities in your setting?
They're actually very distant. But like I was trying to, this world is very isolated. It's like, I haven't sent a map of Millennia recently, but basically there's like these 13 kingdoms crammed into this like little peninsula with like a ring of islands around it and then like a ring of mountains on the land. So they're very like isolated, And a lot of their stories, not like about the creation of the world, but after the creation of the world, they have these stories about warring with other people and then being driven to this peninsula where the gods keep them safe. And so for them, the gods are like, even if they never like actually interact with them, they have like the proof of their existence, and the mountains exist to keep the outsiders from coming into their land, and they have the islands with the ocean surrounding them to keep people from coming from the sea, and they have the entrance to the afterlife is in the center of this peninsula, and that's where like people's souls like wander as ghosts after they die. And so because of that, they have all this like evidence that the gods are there, and like they have like religious organizations. There's like a unique one to each kingdom, because each of the kingdoms is like the specific chosen people of each of the gods, basically. So it's like they all believe in all of the gods, but then they just believe that they're like chosen specifically by one specific god. And they're all kind of like brought together by their fear of outsiders, basically.
Can I ask, how does a god signify that they've chosen someone? Or could someone just be like, yes, I am totally chosen by a god?
It has to do with like where their kingdom is. So my main character, May, is from the kingdom of Gelland, which is and they follow the sun god, Arasha. So it's just like if you were born into that kingdom, you're part of like that god's like chosen people, basically.
Okay.
All right. Yep. Now, you had mentioned a door to the underworld at the center of the peninsula, and I think that's probably kind of important religiously.
It is. That is important religiously. That's actually where a lot of the story takes place, because May, even though she's born of Gelland, because of lore reasons that I haven't fully fleshed out yet, Aksha doesn't have any people born into their kingdom. So instead, people from other kingdoms are chosen to become like the people that guide souls to the afterlife, basically. So there's a giant courthouse in the middle of this like massive forest that like no one lives in. It's full of like old ruins and stuff. So they believe that there used to be people that lived there, but they left or all died or something. So you just have basically just the 7 guardians who work at this giant courthouse to like and they like channel Aksha through them to like judge the souls of the dead and send them to a different afterlife based on how they lived their lives.
All right. Door to the underworld, very important. We love a good courthouse god.
I do love it. It's amazing.
Now, we had mentioned the intersections of other religions going on. Do you got any of this going on? And like, how do you combat other faiths in this world? Or is it more of the xenophobia that they've been experienced and talking about really keeps those at bay?
Oh, it really keeps that at bay. It's really hard to get into the Millennium Peninsula. Basically, you could in theory come in through the sea, but there are like a ring of islands surrounding the outer coast, which are guarded by like a bunch of like, not pirates, but like, you know, like they have like naval forces that like protect the outside, and even if they didn't, it's still like considered like very difficult water to traverse. And then the only way through on land, because everywhere that the peninsula is connected to the rest of the world is like extremely mountainous, so it's really hard to get through. There's like one big pass called the Maelstrom Pass that people can get through, and it's heavily guarded by the followers of the mountain god. So they do get travelers occasionally, but generally they don't let people through very often, and when they do let them through, they tend to be like, you know, heavily guarded and followed. And if they'd like try to preach their religion, it usually doesn't get very far.
Fair. So, one aspect that I know Gabe kind of touched on is the terminology of demigod.
I love demigods.
I think we all do. Again, Greek mythology, Percy Jackson. It's really nice flavor, and it again adds that sort of personal element to divine power. Any of that going on in your setting, and if so, is it like gods boning mortals, or is it a different process of like choosing a champion sort of deal?
There are not any demigods in Millennia, actually. I do have like mages, and that's probably like the closest anyone could get, because magic is generally considered like a boon from one of the gods, usually Aksha, but not always. But again, they wouldn't call themselves demigods. I wouldn't call them demigods.
Okay.
I have demigods in other settings.
Can't have demigods in every damn setting. Yeah, fair.
Not with that attitude.
Zeus had a can-do attitude. We see where that got him.
Yeah.
No, they didn't fit this setting in my head, because I can't talk about it on the podcast, but we can talk about it after the podcast.
Secrets.
There's a lot of secrets about this setting that I can't discuss, that I think make it more interesting.
All right. So, I had a couple interesting examples going around. I had a topic in mind for another go at it, but I can't remember off the top of my head, so I'm going to formulate that for a second while Lee draws a setting out of a hat and discusses the gods out of that, and we poke her with questions. What's the panic decision? Which world?
Before I continue, if you are a teacher in Fox Lake and you are listening to this podcast, get out. Leave. Because this is a D&D world setting. Because I don't use gods too often in my world building unless I plan to run a D&D campaign in them. And the reason I make gods in D&D campaigns is because I really like the flavor of paladins. Unfortunately, I love the flavor of paladins. So this is your last warning, Ollie. Yeet yourself out of the podcast.
You've been called out.
You have, sir. Yeet. You too, Farah, if you're listening. Now that Ollie is presumably, if he's listening, which I don't know, maybe he is, maybe he isn't. But if you are still here, prepare yourself. So, D&D has a lot of pre-established gods. And it's really cool to play in that sandbox because they're gods that are established to interact with special snowflakes. There's not necessarily any canon demigods, but that's because your players, if they play long enough, will essentially become demigods, especially if you have a cleric or a warlock or a paladin. Those are essentially becoming the demigods of your setting. So I figured, when I was sitting down to make a setting, does everyone here know how Loth is portrayed in regular Forgotten Realms?
Nope.
Okay. So Loth is a spider queen, and she's bad news. She's bad news bears. She is the queen of the webbed abysses, which is exactly as awful as it sounds. She's the main god of the evil elves that live underground, so to speak. So, what happened with her is way back when she got kicked out of heaven by Corlond after a large series that I won't go into, because if you really want to investigate that lore, go wiki it yourself, because I refuse to regurgitate it right now. But I was sitting there, and this was with Tyler, of course, and we were talking about how Loth's story from a different point of view just kind of sounds like slander. So we kind of did a little different flip, and this spawned from a universe we called Always Sunny in the Forgotten Realms. And so Loth was dating Corlon in this universe, and then they broke up, but Corlon, who was the king of the gods at the time for the elves, kicked her out into the demon pits. And so I was like, that sounds like a really bitchy story. So I wanted to take Loth and flip her so that her anger and revenge would be almost sympathetic. So I created something that she spreads called the Blight. And it's essentially what happened is when they kicked a god out of their pantheon, they fractured the fabric of their reality. Which has the nasty situation where realities start to collapse in and of themselves. So if you have two different versions of a god in different realities, and when that fabric tore, both of those gods are collapsing into one being. But this happens on a planar scale. So in the D&D world that the teachers who are not listening to this podcast, hopefully, are playing in, is essentially it's being blighted. Because different versions of their reality and different versions of their gods are all collapsing into each other. And that's what I like to use gods for. Generally. I like to use gods, especially in fantasy campaigns, as an antecedent to whatever's happening. I don't really necessarily like my characters interacting with them, because like Gabe said earlier, it's hard. Especially if you have a setting like Faerun, where there's multiple gods spanning multiple years and they all fight each other. It's really hard to balance. So I figured if I have a setting, I'm not going to let my characters interact with the gods unless I have to. And yeah, that's basically the gods and monsters of both that setting.
That's fun.
The Blight designed monsters are hellishly wonderful.
I love them.
Talk about Arathis and since what his domain is, how the Blight doesn't necessarily affect him.
Okay, so Arathis, for the non-super dweebs out there, is a god of law and civilization. And I sat there and I was like, Arathis is a god that I really like in setting because it's just law and civilization, which unfortunately I am a nerd for. And so I figured Arathis, law is law no matter where you go. The concept of law is the same in almost every single universe and every single setting in Dungeons and Dragons that I've heard of. I haven't heard of a single setting that was like, there is no law, because if you have a law where there is no law, there is still law in that order. So Arathis, when it collapses into itself, is basically like, sup, do you like law? Yeah, I like law. Okay, now we're precedent for this universe. And it just evolves because law itself evolves as people do. So Arathis is the one god besides Loth that is just sitting there. And he's like, you know what? Yeah, you were wronged. That's illegal. Let's go. So, yeah.
That's illegal.
It is! You have no idea how much of my
illegal.
world building is based off of the idea of whether something is legal or not and how to get away with it. It's actually disgusting.
Yeah, for someone who likes to play rogues and do crimes, Lee is all about legal systems.
They're
You
beautiful.
have to
I
know
love
what's
studying them.
illegal if you want to break the law.
Fair points. Fair points.
Yep. But no. So that's one of my more interesting god-powered settings. If we want to talk about interesting gods, though, something I do want to bring up is the idea of gods powered by belief. Because I'm sure everyone here has come across the trope, right?
This
Yes,
is a topic
yes.
that I forgot I was going to bring up. Thank you for stealing the brain cell from me. And
Thank you.
with it.
Yes,
I
delightful.
love this.
So, is anyone here familiar with Discworld?
By
Familiar,
Terry
haven't
Pratchett.
read it.
Terry Pratchett?
I've read one page of it.
I have 2 of the books and I have not read either of them yet.
I have only read what Lee has force-fed me by sending me, like, word-for-word quotations of, like, 10 pages that I wake up to some mornings.
One day I will just screenshot him an entire book and trick him into reading The Night Watch, because it's a beautiful book.
She screenshotted me entire comics before, so, like, this is not an idle threat, but continue about Discworld.
This is how I infect you with the comic disease. So, Discworld. Discworld is really great because Terry Pratchett didn't want to deal with gods necessarily, but he also had to have him in the setting because the entire Discworld is a satire and parody, or it started out, of basic fantasy tropes. And you need gods in your basic fantasy trope. So Terry Pratchett took this and said anything you believe enough, if enough people believe it, it becomes a god. So my favorite god in the Discworld pantheon is the god of things stuck in drawers. Because when you're trying to pull something out and the drawer won't open because something's stuck in it and you swear, by Discworld logic, that swearing has to go somewhere, so it spawned a god.
That's amazing.
It's delightful.
Why haven't I read these books yet?
They are delightful. They're also kind of intimidating to get into sometimes because there's like so many of them. So that's Terry Pratchett's view on gods. And it's actually great because in the Discworld, no one's an atheist. And Gabe, you kind of brought this up earlier as well, because like, how are you an atheist when gods are like all up in your face? And the reason that no one in Discworld is an atheist is because the gods will zerp you with lightning. You don't have to choose a god to worship. You don't have to worship anyone. You just have to say, hey gods, you exist. And then that's good enough. Except for one golem whose name is Dwarf. And he's a golem, so when they zap him with lightning, he's like, that could have been a coincidence. And he's honestly a delightful character. But let's talk about belief gods, because I have an interesting little setting based on them.
So, I've obviously loved this trope from inception because it kind of takes divine power away from gods and puts it into the believer, right? And I'm all for like human and sentient centric belief systems as a whole, and especially ones where we have our power. It's basically my current actual life belief system to some extent. Lee, I'm not going to out you, but that was hilarious what you just did. So I love a good belief system, and I love stories that relate to a god losing power based on people stopping believe in them. And I've seen it done. What I've never seen done is one where people are actively trying to dissuade other believers to reduce a god's power. Like some antagonist is specifically changing the beliefs of people. Lee's looking at me incredulously because I know we invented one of these settings, but I say I've never seen it done. Not that we haven't done it, I've never seen something else do it.
I was about to say, sir, we spent too long on that setting.
Yeah, we did. But yes, beliefs as gods. Any other examples and things?
One of my worlds is based on this as well.
Hell yes.
It's a good trope.
It's a fantastic
It's so good. This is specifically my I never know what to call them. My realm, my universe called Heia, which has a lot of very heavily inspired Christian mythos in it as well. But specifically, the gods in this world are like, I tend to call them manifestations rather than like beliefs.
Yep.
So like, for example, I have like 3 major ocean gods, and all of them are based on like different ideas about the ocean. Like one is the ocean is scary, and one is like the ocean is pretty, and one is like the ocean is strong, like that kind of stuff. Which is really fun. And then also like the idea of like power is into it. So just, I have like a character in this setting that I use the name Leviathan for. And she started off as like one of these 3 major sea gods, specifically the god of like the fear of the ocean and like, you know, what's in the depths, people die in the ocean. Like that's what she's the manifestation of. But she's also a demon based on like the idea of like the 7 deadly sins, and Leviathan is the demon of envy. So in my setting, basically demons are a mix of like gods, angels, demigods, some humans potentially, who, because especially gods, in the case of Leviathan, for example, she wanted to have her power, and she didn't like that her power was reliant on people's like belief or fear of her. And so she wanted to take her power into her own hands. And so demons are basically powerful beings that have found a way to bring their power into their own hands instead of relying on the belief of other people.
Interesting. Sources of power determining classification. Interesting.
Yeah, I love it. I've literally been vibrating the past since you brought this up because I love this so much.
Excellent.
Good.
And just like, and then just like, ways of getting your power classifies it, and just the gods having to rely on certain powers and like, you know, gods coming into existence as new manifestations emerge, as like new things are invented and discovered, and other gods fading out of existence as they like no longer like matter as much, you know. It's very fun.
Now, I know Lee's got a topic on this one, but Gabe, quickly, any experience with the idea that belief powers the deity?
So I do sort of have experience with this. It's a little less direct than like direct belief, but it's more like the consequences of human actions, I guess, if that makes any sense. But it is also like a bit of belief. So essentially, I have these two gods, Era and Melo, who are respectively the gods of order and chaos. And as with how Parad feeds off contest and Korsho feeds off death, Era feeds off the concept of order, and Melo feeds off chaos. So naturally, these two sort of initially had like an antagonistic relationship because of their but eventually what they realized was that in order for them to both be fed, they needed like it was the process of order and the process of chaos that was giving them power, and not necessarily just the concepts itself. So they needed to create states of order and chaos in order to keep each other alive. And so what they did was they created fake gods. There's Demos, the god of order, who is actually Melo in disguise, and Chalice, the god of chaos, who is actually Era in disguise. And they orchestrate and both Demos and Chalice, they're like the ones who are like deified in the world, and they're the ones who are like known as the gods of order and chaos, even though they're swapped. And they like orchestrate conflict between each other in order to reestablish order and instigate chaos on each other's behalf in order to like feed each other's power.
An interesting symbiotic relationship between two gods.
Yeah, they're great. I can't wait to actually write these books because they're like my favorites.
I like it because it's really interesting because most of the time when people talk about gods are either fighting or they're taking power away from each other or they're completely removed. But like if you look at it like that, the gods by nature have to be interacting and almost like symbiotic. So I think that's a really awesome take on it.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's neat.
So, I have a weird little setting that I'd love to write something in one day. And it's essentially the idea, once again, belief or a whole bunch of people believing something create a god. So I'm pretty sure we're all aware of American Gods, right?
Yep.
I haven't read yet.
Fair enough.
It's annoying that I haven't read it because it's Neil Gaiman and I love him.
It's really good. I'd give it a read, but essentially the idea of this is heavily inspired, kind of, sort of, by American Gods. Because in American Gods, like, it goes through the different modern-day gods that people create accidentally, like the god of iron for the railroads, and things like that. So I wanted to take that, and with Tyler's help, because once again, I'm pretty sure Tyler and I were both drunk when we were talking about this, and we were talking about how to bring gods into an urban fantasy. Because urban fantasy is a really popular genre right now, but gods in urban fantasy are kind of a sticking point, unless you are dealing with actual real-world religions, and then that gets really, like, dubious onto itself. So, I thought, what if the city itself is a god in its way? And it is influenced by the way people act in the city and how large it is. So each city in itself is almost a competing god for powers. So if you have a small town, you obviously have a smaller, less powerful god that could, theoretically, especially if you're Airdrie, be eaten by a bigger god and subsumed into the mass. And then kind of become a neighborhood god, depending on how hard people believe or want to stick to their identity as being from that person. And so from this idea, a whole bunch of really interesting gods were spawned as we kind of chose one facet about Calgary in particular that we decided enough people do that it would spawn a god. My personal favorite is the god of early morning joggers, which imbibes the spirit of all the people that get up stupid early to jog around the city. And so we describe him as just a regular dude in, the really bright running shorts, running in the fog. And if this god wants to talk to you, he won't talk to you himself. He will possess the various joggers around you. Because every jogger is just slowly working their way into becoming an early morning jogger.
Yeah, we imagine some pretty fun scenes where if your characters need to commune with the early morning jogger god, they have to get up stupid early and go jogging in the fog and are surrounded by like dozens of his disciples all speaking in one voice, telling you the information you need. Yeah, early morning jogger god.
He's good.
That's horrible and I love it.
Right? And then with this, we were also talking about small gods that inhabit buildings. So if you have a school, and say it was a really poorly run school, it had a really bad history of violence and bullying and abuse, the god that represents that school would represent that. They would be a nasty little kid. So in the setting we created, there would be people who have a specific job to knock down buildings and kill these corrupted gods, or try and kill the god to recreate a new one. Which is why areas are quote-unquote haunted. Which is where we get my favorite thing to shove into worlds, which is orders of totally not paladins.
Totally paladins.
Totally not paladins.
Totally paladins.
Nope. Not paladins. Never a paladin. I will never create a paladin. So there's entire order of people, and like things like workplace safety or OSHA itself would be a god, but that'd be a wider god. Because there's things that are universal across all cities. So those are more powerful. Yep, that's the setting. There's a whole bunch of other anecdotes, but I feel like other people should talk as well.
I think we call that one city gods.
It was city gods, yeah.
City gods, yeah.
That's fun. That's really fun.
And like, part of the reason I like this one is the almost nebulous nature of it, in how different gods can be subsumed or interacting. Like, yeah, I'm a denizen of Charbel. The Charbel god is my god, but it's truthfully just a smaller piece of the larger Calgary god, right? And so if I'm interacting with the one, I'm kind of interacting with the other, but not the whole of it. And it creates this weird pseudo-evolving pantheon, right? Which is something I really enjoy. Makes the gods a bit more ephemeral, but also tangible at the same time.
One other thing that I have to point out is in this setting, if you as a human being start to embody your structure, whether you want it or not, you will become a god of that. Which I thought was a really cool way to go about it. So the mayor of a city, if the mayor is loved and starts becoming the face of the city that represents the city to both its citizens and people outside of it, one day you will dipsy doodle and, you don't exist as a corporeal being anymore. Because you are now the god of, say, Calgary. Or your corporation. Right?
Oh my god, that sounds horrifying.
It is a little horrifying, but I kind of like that aspect of it.
I'm just like imagining being the god of Calgary.
Yeah, it would suck.
Better than being a god of Edmonton.
Yep.
Not by much.
Yeah. And then in this setting, you also have gods fighting each other, because we also have a god of, like, people who are not homed. And because that's a large population of people, he, so to speak, is also a god, and they all sit on a council together, which is the quote-unquote city council. So when people try to get together to solve things, and they're like, okay, we're going to make sure that we have less homeless people in the city. And then the god of those people is like, excuse me, what? Are you trying to get rid of me, man? And then there's also the god of early morning parties. Sorry. Hungover mornings and late night parties. Who is very opposed to all these liquor laws that just came in. Excuse me. So it creates a nice little tension in between the gods.
Remember how earlier you were talking about how you really like law and cities?
Right? It's like she only has one theme that she constantly reuses in just different colors. It's great.
Shh. No one needs to know.
Mood, though, to be honest.
I'm not complaining. It's just an observation, friend. You know I
Like
turn
I
to
said,
you about my legals all the time.
I only have one character in D&D, and I only have one vibe. No others.
No other vibes. No other vibes. Well, we've gotten some very interesting examples of like belief-based gods, conflicts, demigods, and like the powers they bestow. One thing I want to talk about now is maybe like the power levels of gods and how we like to go about deciding that. Because if we're talking about, say, the city gods, it's not like one of them's gonna walk around and bitch slap a dude for saying the wrong thing, but Zeus would totally lightning strike someone for saying the wrong thing. So, like, I think, Gabe, in your setting, your ruler gods, deities, would definitely, like, if confronted by someone, smack them down. But, Alex, I don't think yours would be nearly so egregiously confident, right? So, let's talk power level. How much power do your gods have over their people, over their settings? Can they throw lightning bolts? I don't know.
Depends on the setting.
Depends on the god.
Ooh.
That too.
Gods more powerful than others?
Oh, absolutely. Some of them are weak as shit.
And is that like determined based on belief, or is this more a course of their own world building and how they were spawned?
It's the second thing. So some of them draw power from something that is like, so for example, Viral, the god of knowledge and wisdom, doesn't draw his power from an especially strong source. So he's just like he's like I would say he's like the most chill of the gods. He just hangs out in like his little hut. He doesn't really do much. He can't really fight. He's like he's like a skinny nerdy guy in a hut. And then one of the two moon gods, Nocturus, was sort of born as a twin god, and he got the short end of the god power stick, and he was born especially weak. And he's like sort of kept in secret by his brother in order to keep him safe.
Now you're saying like weak. That's compared to other gods. Could like regular Joe Blow Schmo, walk up and give him a knock on the head and finish him off, or are we talking like higher power levels than that?
I would say Nocturus could possibly take on the average person, but it would be like an especially strong normal human could fight Nocturus.
Interesting.
And Viral, like you or me, could fight Viral. He has no fighting ability whatsoever, and he has no like real divine strength other than his mind.
Interesting. So like pretty weak gods, but still gods by classification of their domain.
Yeah, and then some of them are strong gods by classification of. There's this one guy, Gilgamesh, who is the god of storms, and he's a strong. He's like sometimes classified as the strongest god. He's like a dude's a fucking Chad, except he's one of the only demigods who was born a human and became a god through just he bulked so much and he worked out so much that the other demigods recognized his divinity, and he was like just accepted into the pantheon by just being an extremely strong normal human.
The whey protein makes you divine? What?
Yeah. He spent 200 years working out and fighting monsters with his bare hands and mastering storm sorcery to the point where he was recognized as the strongest human, and they were like, hey, so you're a god. You're a god. We'll recognize you because it's more. There's more god stuff than how I'm describing it. But yeah, he was basically
Bulked so hard they gave me a spot in heaven. Hell yeah. Damn. Okay.
So people can become gods in this setting then? That's interesting.
Some of them can become gods. Gilgamesh is the only one who has done it, but it is possible.
Do they have to become gods through consent of the other gods and demigods, or can you bulk so hard without any like acknowledgement that you are then a god of bulking?
You can bulk so hard that you become as strong as a god, like in terms of power scaling. Because I'm a loser who does power scaling, but like as far as being recognized as like a member of the pantheon, that has to be by the consensus of the other gods. It has to be the other gods have to recognize you. You can't. There are beings who are like functionally stronger than some of the gods in the pantheon who are not recognized as demigods because of other reasons.
Okay. So if they don't like your vibes, you don't pass the god check.
Yeah, so there are a lot of people in Glassburn who have massive power through like more demonic and nefarious means, and they're not recognized as godkin because they sort of cheated their way to power.
So
is how some see it.
My question is then, what separates is it only the acknowledgement that separates a god from a superpowered being? Because like if we took Superman and dropped him into that universe, would he be a god or would he be like kicked out of the pantheon for vibes?
It would be a matter of consensus. They would have to vibe well with Superman.
Excellent. I love it.
Does the god consensus come with like a membership card? Like what are the perks of being part of the co-op?
Well, for Gilgamesh, the perks of being part of the co-op was that he got to fight more, and that he got more access to more magic that he could use, and he got access to more like sacred texts that he could study to learn how to fight better. He became immortal through it. That's sort of like the thing, I guess. But like that's more most of the demigods are born with natural immortality, and Gilgamesh just bulked so hard that he became immortal.
Why am I getting some solid Saitama vibes? Anyways,
that is actually that's pretty much what his arc is too. His whole character arc is that he wants to fight the protagonist because he thinks that's the only good fight he can get.
Love that motivation. Yeah. I like the idea of weak gods. That's a very interesting one. And the idea that mortals can become gods is something I've definitely played around with in the past, though again I've tended to shy away from it at current just because I find I have to work that in mechanically into a setting, and it leads to some brain looping. But Alex, are all your gods created equal in your settings?
Again, it depends on the setting. I feel like the only one that I can really talk about without getting into like spoiler territory is Heia, in which case the gods as manifestations all have very different power levels. Mm-hmm. And like I said, like I tend to classify them into like major gods and minor gods, with the major gods being like the most powerful, and Leviathan is one of those, except she kind of like froze her power level when she became a demon. But like, yeah, but I would say that all of my gods are more powerful than humans. The way Heia works is I have kind of like a power level structure. I actually literally just pulled it up because I was like, this might come up in a second. But like kind of at the bottom you have like mundane, which is just humans, basically. And then above that, I have what I classify as like semi-arcane beings, which they're basically human, but they have magic of some kind.
Human but spicy.
Humans but spicy. So that's where I classify like my magical girls and like my vampire hunter type characters. Above that, I have the arcane, which are like this is where you get like vampires, werewolves, like mermaids, shapeshifters, witches, psychics, all that kind of stuff fit into that. They don't tend to be like overly powerful, but they're more powerful than like humans. Above that, I have the semi-divine beings, which is where you get like demigods and like heroes. You get like Nephilim and the demonic equivalent, and you get prophets, which are very weird in my world. And then above that, you have the divine beings, which are the gods, the angels, the demons, the arcana, which are too complicated to talk about. And I have ascended beings written down, but I don't actually think I have any of those, so I don't know what that's referring to. And so the power level kind of like stacks like that. So, you know, a human will never be more powerful than like a hunter or a magical girl, but a hunter or a magical girl will never be more powerful than like the arcane beings, like the vampires and werewolves and all that. The arcane beings will never be more powerful than like the demigods, and the demigods will never be more powerful than like the gods.
I love how you've just run the gamut from mundanes to gods, and somewhere in there is magical girls. It's a great power scaling.
I needed to put them in there somewhere. Of course, there is overlap between these as well. Like, I have a character who had one parent who was a god and the other was a vampire. So I'm like, is he classified as a vampire or a demigod? Well, I tend to put them like higher. The higher one is where they fit. So then, you know, if I have a magical girl who is also a Nephilim, she's just really powerful.
Good.
But yeah, no, my gods tend to be at the top. But within each of the different like classifications, the power levels vary.
I do have a flavor question. So when you mentioned gods, you also mentioned demons and angels. What is the difference, or is it just flavor? And what they do?
Gods are manifestations of concepts, usually. Angels are the weird one. They were specifically created by the god of angels.
Nice.
The god of angels being one of the more powerful gods, I guess. So he can create very powerful beings, which are angels. Demons are usually they're either gods or angels. Sometimes they can be demigods who have basically cut ties with their like original power source and have created their own.
Strong, independent demon who don't need no belief.
No, exactly. Literally, that's what it is. That's like I have, two of my, again, because I play a lot into like Christian mythology and I love playing with like the 7 deadly sins. So 2 of my archdemons, who are the archdemons of lust and gluttony, were originally angels, but they didn't like the god of angels, so they were basically like, fuck you, and made their own
dad.
You're not my real dad.
Yeah, they're great. I love them. I'm a huge fan of my archdemons, all of them, all 8 of them.
Wait, there's only 7 sins. What's the 8th?
I know.
What's the 8th?
That gets complicated. I actually, technically, if I count Lucifer, I have 9. So there's 2 extras.
Lee is patting my shoulder over what you just said.
I'm sorry. Lucifer's fun because he's also an archangel, so he also has a virtue. We don't have to talk about that, though. We can talk about this at a later date. This isn't what we're talking about.
Well, it kind of is. It sort of kind of is.
Gods and monsters.
And myths. So, like, all apply. So, I haven't really touched on Mythic Cosmos too much yet. And
Planet gods.
Planet gods. And yeah, there you go. That's my summary.
Go on.
Damn, I was hoping for more awkward silence. Come on, it's been the theme. So, a lot of these topics we've been discussing, I've wanted to sort of interject, but a lot of the concepts of the planet gods in Mythic Cosmos are very intertwined. So I kind of wanted to take a little trip on the creation story of the dear solar system, which will help explain a lot of the concepts and put them together. And because this is a weird sci-fi pseudo-history we're working with, we're going to start with the very beginning of our known galaxy, you know, the Big Bang, that real fun thing.
Kaboom.
And then everything... Yeah, where's the explosion sound effect on the
You
keyboard?
turned off the piano, man.
I did.
I was
It's the
waiting
perfect
for it.
time.
Terrible times.
And then dust starts to, you know, mix itself and then form into larger bodies and then create gravity. And what we decided in setting was how sentience was formed. And we decided that an interesting concept would be sentience is directly related to gravity and being able to produce it and create it. So, everything is kind of sentient, except the actual void of space. This is very important in setting. So let's go a couple billion years in the future from the Big Bang, and our sun is formed. Hey, it's huge. It's got a lot of gravity. It is sentient, as is every other star in the sky. What does sentience mean? Well, it means it can communicate. It means it has personality, wants, desires, and things. However, a giant sun, which in setting is either called a titan or an astron, depending on their nomenclature, its wants and needs are far too different from humans to even bother necessarily discussing, but it is conversing with all the others of its species. How does it do that? Well, through gravity and light. For those of you who have some knowledge of physics, everything does produce gravity, and every gravitational effect is affecting every other gravitational effect ad infinitum, quite literally. And so that is what we decided was our basis for language and communication as well. So the sun's gravity is gently tugging in minute ways at all the other things in the surrounding galaxy, and they're talking. So every star in the sky is having a trillion conversations at once with every other star in the sky. And that's the start. That concept does not come up too much in the actual Mythic Cosmos. That's like a really big cosmic level thing that doesn't really have too much effect on the stories we tell. But it lays the groundwork for what we get into of the planets. So, the sun has gravity. It pulled plenty of dust and things towards it that eventually formed into smaller gravitational pools, a la the planets, gods, in the setting. There's one more secret I want to say about the sun before we get too far past, and that is, since we are in its gravitational pull, we are sort of part of it, in a sense. Every solar system is an equal distribution of weights and gravities that hold it in a perfect shape that keeps it running. And so, in terminology standpoints, like, all the planets and stuff in our solar system act as the sun's organs in a strange and cosmic way. But that's the most basic, like, human interpretation we can come up with. So keep that in a little bit of mind. And the planets have formed. Hooray! They all have sentience. They all have their own gravities and their own personalities. And they interact with each other in exactly the same way, just on a smaller scale to the sun. They converse with each other. They tell stories. They have adventures and stuff and do things. Again, far beyond the realm of how humans deal with. They consider the sun basically mother, not necessarily God, though it depends planet to planet. This means we can also get smaller things like moons that have a gravity and talk as well, and the moons based on size are classified as demigods. Getting smaller, we have comets, which are classified as oracles due to the fact that they do get pulled into the sun's rotation, but their orbit is fucking massive in comparison to the planets, and so they go well beyond the sun's heliosphere to interact with things outside of the sun's general influence. And then we have asteroids, which we classify as gargoyles in terminology, which a lot of them are so little gravity that they basically don't have sentience, though a very few of them do and can converse and chat with others, though it's often a much more loose sentience than some.
They're a bit spacey.
They're a bit spacey, and that's something coming from this setting. So, that's the generalist of how these things work. There's one much more fantastical aspect to this that I wanted to get into now. To make it so that the gods could actually interact with the setting, we decided that they could produce an avatar of themselves that can interact and do things. And this avatar, for all intents and purposes, is like an elemental human, basically, created of the soil and rock of the planet. And it is filled with the gravitational energy of said planet. So it is them and they are it. And they can send that out to do things, because it doesn't need to fucking breathe, it doesn't need to eat, it's basically a sentient pile of rocks in a very interesting shape of a person. And that is how the gods have interacted a lot of the time. As well, if two gods have a dispute, they will create an avatar each, and they will slug it out, throwing gravity at each other and smashing the avatar into little bitty bits.
Cute.
Now, where the fuck do humans get into this? Well, the gods have been around for a really long-ass time. They're kind of bored of each other in some situations. You would be too if you spent several billion years with the exact same neighbors and cast all around you. And one planet in particular, Gaia, wanted something a bit different. And so Gaia approached the sun, disillusioned with her life and considering some strange alternatives. And the sun offers her a reprieve, a change, something she's heard about, something that the sun has interacted with on other stars and been told about, and so drags dear Gaia just a bit closer in orbit. Right into the nice habitable zone, where the nice frozen pools and stuff like that begin to thaw, and things begin to change on Gaia compared to any of the other planets. Gaia creates an avatar and goes down and guides all these things happening on her surface. And eventually something else pops out. And that something else is dear humankind. And as humankind pops out, Gaia finds herself slightly weaker. And as more humans come, slightly weaker and weaker, until she's barely able to produce an avatar at all. And that avatar does not have hardly any power. It's basically a basic human. And she sends it to talk amongst these people who are fighting, who are warring on her surface, who are showing all the pettiness and things that all her brothers and sisters and the other gods had. And she wants them to stop, lest they fall into bad habit. And then we kill said avatar. There's my Jesus representation in story. Thanks, everyone. I had to include it.
At least once.
And this is the last straw for Gaia, and she basically goes into a coma. But humans keep going and going. And in setting, this is something we've discussed but haven't necessarily figured out a story for yet. Humans are Gaia's new avatar. We can't survive in space. We need food, we need water, we need all these things that a regular avatar would not, because we are Gaia's will and, to some extent, soul and intelligence spread super thin over billions and billions of lives. The other gods kind of fucking hate us because we kind of killed one of their sisters.
Especially Venus.
Especially Venus. Venus is very mad at us. But the sun knows what has happened. The sun sees everything within its heliosphere and knows that we are technically the newest form of Gaia. And so she forbids any of the other gods from killing our asses. How do we have the names of the planets? Now, this is an interesting subject in setting. We've named them all after Roman and Greek gods, right? Why did we do that? why do we have these myths of these gods interacting? And what it is since we are the prospects of Gaia and still Gaia, we can still be interacted with by the gravitational pulls and pushes of the planets. We just can't understand it like Gaia used to. We don't have the weight, we don't have the sentience behind it that she did. But we still have a little bit. And so when the gods are telling these stories and having these battles and adventures with each other, we pick up on them, but we interpret them into our own sphere. So a story of, I don't know, Zeus becoming a bull and banging some guy's queen to create a little monster, that is something that Jupiter, who is the interpretation of Zeus in the celestial sphere, did. Though it was more creating a moon with someone else behind Saturn's back that we just couldn't interpret because, again, we don't have the same gravitational forces that the other larger avatars and planets do. But we have our myths, which are surprisingly closely related to the myths of the actual gods and celestials that exist around us. And then eventually we develop space travel, start interacting with them all. A few of them come out to greet us. Venus is very mad and kills like a couple million people. And yeah, we have the Mythic Cosmos setting.
That's all she wrote. Well, not all, but that's
We're hoping to write more, to be honest.
a valid chunk.
I'm obsessed.
It's solid, right? It's fucking...
It's really fucking good.
This is fantastic. When's your first novel coming out?
Never!
That's true.
Oh!
Boo!
Boo! Right?
I want to read it.
You should tell them about Hercules, though.
Oh, I can tell you about Hercules, yeah. So if we're going to touch on a quick myth. So we have demigods as moons, right? Demigods in a normal Greek mythology setting are a god fucked a human, hooray! But since a god is a planet, it doesn't really work. Except for one dude. Hercules.
Okay.
And how did we decide it? It was basically like we got some of Gaia's essence into one body enough.
Yeah.
That we convinced Jupiter to then have sex with it and create something with quite a bit more power level, but it only happened once. It only worked once.
So I think what happened is they sent a shuttle out to Jupiter, and almost everyone else on that shuttle died, except for, like, one lady. And because everyone else died, the essence went into that person, and when she arrived, there was a dude there.
Yeah.
And Jupiter is Zeus.
Yeah. It also, touching on naming notes, like Saturn is the Roman god of Kronos, technically, but for our mythological purposes, Saturn is actually Hera, and all that is in setting explanation is we fucked up which ones we named based on the gravitational fields because, again, we can't read them properly. So, like, we do have most of the gods represented in some way, shape, or form. Like, Venus is supposed to be Aphrodite, goddess of beauty. We kind of misinterpreted that. Venus is extremely angry and would actually be Ares in most mythologies. We just misnamed Venus pretty hard there. Yeah.
What about Uranus?
Uranus was god of sky, if I remember correctly.
God of Gaia?
Since I've looked at my stuff. But it was Uranus and Gaia were the first two titans that ended up producing the rest of the titans, right?
Yeah.
I forget who was Uranus? It was, because obviously Neptune's are Poseidon.
Yeah.
Uranus is just Uranus in Greek mythology.
I think Uranus was going to be a very weird one.
Uranus was going to be, like, the buildy guy.
Yeah. Oh, Hephaestus.
Yes.
Yeah,
Uranus was supposed to be Hephaestus.
Or Vulcan in Roman. Yeah, Uranus was supposed to be Vulcan.
Okay.
Pluto's a fun one. You know how we kicked Pluto out of the planetary assembly?
Yeah, and it hurt all of us.
The reason we did that is actually because the other planets all voted that Pluto was going to be exiled from their spheres because of something he did. Everyone ready to hear about demons now?
Yeah.
Okay. Planets can form outside of the influence of a sun or star. we've recorded a couple of them IRL, and they look really weird, and they're very strange how they work in real life. But in setting, that's what a demon is a planet that has created itself through gravitation outside of a sun's light. And they basically form in the darkness of space with no one to talk to. They're sentient, billions of light years away from anything else that has sentience. And they go fucking crazy.
Yeah, I bet.
They travel for billions, literal billions of years towards a source of light. And by the time they get to a source of light, they are usually beyond batshit. And they are kind of a large antagonist in the greater cosmic sphere of the Mythic Cosmos. They're classified by size as well, with ghouls being like smaller asteroids, demons being more middling moons and stuff like that. And then when you get to actually very large planetoids, they're just dark gods. We don't interact with them too much.
They're scary.
They're very scary, but because they still have gravitation, they can interact with things from a very, very far way off. And we do have a touch of space madness that goes on in the Mythic Cosmos, so if you're away from people for too long, sometimes you can feel the influence of a dark god touching you with their gravity from very far away. So why Pluto was kicked out was he caught a dark god, a little ghoul, in his orbit that was coming into the solar system. Except instead of this thing being stark raving fucking mad and angry and talking about eating the light and all the things that normal dark gods do, it was crying. And he took pity on it. And this will be Pluto's moon Charon, who we're pretty sure in real life is actually an outer planetoid that got caught in Pluto's gravity. But because he basically invited a demon into everyone's house just because he took pity on it, and this is going to be Persephone in the lore, by the way. Again, we misnamed something, so Pluto's moon Charon is going to be Persephone in lore-wise. They kicked him out. They exiled him. No one talks to him anymore. They all refuse. And because we are influenced by their gravity, we kicked him out of the 9 planets as well.
Poor guy.
Right? Pretty chill dude.
Something I think is also interesting in this setting, and I'm sorry, I will drop it after this, is how gods will interact with avatars. Because to settle on a planet, the planet is sentient. So if you want to go and start a colony on Mars, you have to go talk to Mars and set up essentially terms and conditions. For what's happening there, which I thought was a really cool way for humans to interact with these gods.
Yeah, we have treaties, mining contracts, and a big precedent that was set was for consent. You cannot mine a sentient being's body without its consent.
Probably for the best.
Yeah, Venus was pretty mad. Everyone's still pretty afraid of Venus after what she did. She killed a lot of people. Yeah. Demons. Fun stuff. We also have them, coming in once in a while. And we've toyed around with the idea of what a demon does once it enters a star's heliosphere. And we decided that, in setting, it would probably be real cool if one of these things actually got to touching a sun. It would be what causes a black hole. Because, big space
I was going to ask about black holes, actually. That's interesting.
Yeah, because black holes are kind of like super gravity or anti-gravity in some extent. So it would be like an all-devouring force that doesn't actually have any thought, right? Which, again, things that are billions upon billions of years old with sentience based off of gravity, they are basically the end of existence. So yeah. All of the planets are like, no letting demons in. And then Pluto's like, this demon is now my girlfriend. And everyone's like, shut up!
You're kicked out.
Kicked out of the house.
Too far.
No coming back. Anyways.
That's the cosmic mythos.
Love it. Obsessed. Write more.
Write more.
I'm always stunned.
questions. We have like every Greek myth now represented in some form or fashion in the cosmic mythos too, which is really fun.
Echo and Narcissus.
Echo is a AI program that got trapped on a guy named Mark's ship and drove him mad because it kept repeating the same message.
Amazing.
Yeah. So again, like tying into the last world building episode, we talked about how like humans and artificials are two of the races. The third race is the celestials, and how they all love to interact, and how we take myths and then turn them on their head, throw some sci-fi spin on them, and that's what we're writing. Yeah.
I love that. That's so fun.
Can't escape the Greek mythology. Can never escape it. Though we did add, like, old British mythology by throwing in the Knights of Camelot. We're trying to add in some more interesting fantasy with, like, orcs and goblins. I'm looking at ways to include other cosmic theologies, like East Asian and Indian mythologies as well in the Mythic Cosmos. Because the gods are just called what we call the planets because that's easy. But they know every name that we've ever given them. So they will also, depending on who they interact with, change what they call themselves to fit whoever's belief is present.
Yeah, no, that's something that I like playing around with too, cautiously. Like in Heia, originally the gods were based off the Greek gods. And then I just decided to just make up my own because I thought that was more fun. But like my original concept was like, and even still, I think this is true to some extent, is that like, you know, the gods are stand-ins for the actual myths that people believe. Like, you know, I have like a god called the Ocean King, which is probably who Poseidon was based off of in that myth and like that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm definitely looking at learning a bit more about mythology and cultures across the world, because obviously I am very rooted in the Greco-Roman classics, and I try to expand my mind a little bit more than that.
Yeah, it's very interesting learning about other religions and stuff. I've really enjoyed what I've learned. Like, it's just very interesting.
Yeah, try to learn from something other than Rick Riordan is what I'm trying to do. I want to get into Egyptian mythology without being, you know, an offensive colonist asshole stealing their myths. So I'm really trying not to do that.
Yeah, don't read the Kane Chronicles.
Yeah, I'm not going to. Definitely not going to. But that's for a Percy Jackson episode, I'm assuming, as well.
I'll probably
So, we've all discussed a few examples as well as concepts ranging from mortals becoming gods to different ways gods gain power and the like. Anyone else have any topics they want to broach that haven't been covered when it comes to deities, myths, and monsters?
I feel like we've brought up demigods a lot, but we haven't actually like talked about them.
I'm down to discuss demigods. So you want to talk about like some you've come up with?
I just think the way that I've done demigods in Heia is very fun.
Hit us.
So I mentioned like my power scale earlier, and I put demigods in the semi-divine. And I said that demigods will never be more powerful than gods. I lied. Sometimes they can be.
How could you? Who would do such a thing?
That's because gods, angels, demons, like the truly divine beings, are never born in my world. Demigods are born. Like, you know, like in Greek mythology, if two gods have a baby, their baby is also a god. In Heia, that's not how it works. If two gods have a baby, their baby is a demigod. They're just really fucking powerful.
Interesting. So, like, the divine essence gets diluted, even if it's between two gods?
Well, no, and that's my point, is it's not necessarily diluted. It can be in some cases, but it doesn't have to be, and that's when you get a demigod who is very powerful. But they're called demigods because they are born rather than created. So even if they're more powerful than a god, they're still classified as a demigod.
I get it. So, like, interesting repercussions of birth and being created after the beginning creating your nomenclature and distinction.
Yeah. Well, and like I talked about Leviathan earlier, and I also have mentioned the Ocean King, and the two of them actually have a child together. She goes by the name Illuyanka, which is after, I believe, a Hittite god. Is like a big sea dragon. And she is like canonically one of my most powerful characters because she's the child of two of like the most powerful gods in existence. And she's like one of the few characters that like the gods would be scared of because of how powerful she is.
Regular old Antichrist you got going on there. Good.
Well, technically because she's born after Leviathan becomes a demon too. So she's like the child of two gods and a demon, sort of.
Good mix.
Yeah. She's great. But yeah, so demigods in my world are a child of a god that was born. They can be born of a god, they can be born of an angel or a demon, they can be born of a human or any like arcane being, but as long as they are born and have one parent who is a god, they are considered a demigod. At least one parent who's a god, I should specify.
So yeah. Like the method of, relations creating demigods. Yeah. Gabe, you've mentioned that like most of your gods are actually demigods?
Yeah. So I guess there's two pantheons in Glass Inferno. There's like gods and demigods, and like most of the demigods are the ones that are like the most prominent in the story. Most of the gods don't really care.
Okay.
What's going on? But the demigods are very active in the world, and there's like story and lore reasons for this. But they're like the most active. So I guess so like, and in universe they're referred to as gods. So like functionally they're gods, but like because of the existence of the way more powerful gods, they're sort of like they're I'm like calling them demigods, but in universe they're referred to as the godkin.
Okay. So like do they have a specific way they form? Or is it just a power level thing where they're called demigods?
So it's for some of them, for like specifically Gilgamesh, it is basically a power level thing because he wasn't born a god. But for most of them, in the other pantheon, in the more cosmic pantheon, there's one being named Eden who is like more or less basically the functional like creator god, like the actual god. And amongst the other pantheon is the arcane immortal, and of like these gods, Eden is like the most sort of human like in his like personality and like brain level. So he was basically like he was not content with like cosmic life in like the lonely cosmic life the way some of the other gods were. So he basically created the demigods out of like boredom, and he did this he took like essential elements of the universe, like the like stars and space and like wisdom and knowledge and like all this other stuff that makes all of them, and he used them to basically form the demigods into existence. So they don't have the power of a cosmic god, but they're not like half gods, if that's what you're asking. They're like full born gods, but they're not as strong as like an actual god.
Okay, that's really cool. I like how they were created out of the base blocks of the universe almost. So then do they become what they were created out of then? Or is it kind of just a smorgasbord?
It sort of depends. Some of them like are some of them like come into existence sort of fully formed, and some of them sort of like have to take some time to become gods. One of them, the ocean god Dewdrop, was sort of born like really small, and he just sort of stayed really, really small. He's a strong god relatively, but he's like a short little guy.
Dewdrop sounds adorable, which I know would get me smited in universe, but Dewdrop.
It's such a good name. Oh my
great.
god. Love that. I always love your god names, Gabe. Like, you had fun with them.
Thank you. Yeah, I wish I could. I could just go through all of them. They all have fun names, but
No, I like your demigods. They're really cool.
yeah. Thank you.
I love demigods as a concept, but again, it's always like trying to work them in, right? A weird example, I guess, that we could have is in our Blood Empire world build. We've sort of got a demigod. Sort of. And Lee's looking at me quizzically because the classification is going to be strange. There's only one god in that setting, and that's our delightful dear Gnostic demiurge who created the world out of pure willful nothingness and ultimate power. Based off of, again, the Gnostic demiurge, it doesn't really have too much of a personality, it just wants. Humans in that setting are, again, wingless angels that were trying to please God's will so he wouldn't throw a tantrum and destroy everything. And so, how do you get a demigod? It's not like God fucks or anything. And how we've decided a pseudo-demigod works in this is, again, based on concentrations of angelic nature. And so, basically, if you can follow the direct line of the first angel to come down to Earth to its most recent descendant, if you can find that and drain it of blood, you create what's known as a divine lich, which is where God, in essence, possesses that body, which is about the closest thing that setting has to a demigod. Not to mention, like, that person is generally pretty powerful, being, you know, pretty closely directed descendant from the most pure strain of angelic nature, without too much delusion. But very different flavor than, we've made a hero. We've made a vessel for God, and he's angry.
Yeah.
Any other points on demigods? Lee, you got any interesting ones to come about?
Honestly, no. I either find I go basic bitch or full god. There's no in between, unless you're like a level 20 D&D character. But that's about it.
Yeah, if you ever reach that far to Gabe, you're basically a demigod.
Yep.
All right. Any other topics of broaching divinity, mythology, etc.?
I've generally talked about what I want to talk about.
I feel like I've talked about a lot.
Alex, satisfied?
I literally have so much stuff I could talk about.
Yeah, this episode, I feel the same way, but I feel like this episode would we should. Well, I mean, we've talked about in the past doing like a sort of like a like an almost just like episodes, separate episodes, just on each of our like worlds and stuff, where we could just like blast through.
Yeah, I think Dean's got it in a plan for something either next season or in between the seasons, where we each get to go off for a long time.
Yeah.
But
yeah. I just know like I didn't talk at all about anything in Katariana, so
you completely left out an entire mythos? Hot damn.
Listen, do I need to find my doc and tell you how many universes exist in my multiverse?
No. I believe. But if everyone's good, I think I'll begin wrapping up.
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. Well then, with all that being said, let's close out for tonight. Thanks everybody for listening in. We are at the InkGuild on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Our main home is on YouTube and Spotify, but you can also connect with us individually through our own social media. If you're interested in what we do, then consider subscribing to our Patreon for as low as $3 for exclusive content. But ultimately, keep an eye out for more podcasts and other creative projects. Thanks again for listening, everyone, and have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.